Salam doston and welcome back to the latest episode of Funkaar ka Pakistan. You're listening to Tanir Jannat live from Radio Lums. उम्मीद है कि आप सब खैरियत से हैं क्योंकि हमारी पिछली मुलाकात से अब तक काफ़ी वक्त गुजर गया है लेकिन it's nice to be back and I hope that all of you have been well and been taking care of yourself with everything that's happening around the world and in Pakistan. It's very important in times like these to understand the value that we have in creating impact, not just for the people around us, but the people that we're interlinked with in so many ways around the world. And following that, we also have to realize the importance of the essence of what this show talks about, which is art, literature, and media. So keeping all of this in mind, we are back and we've revamped the show and it's bigger and better than before. And keeping in line with all of this, we have one of the most prestigious guests that I've had the honor of hosting so far. And as always, pehle main aapko kuch hints bataungi and we'll try to see if you can figure out who the guest is and then we'll have the big reveal. So our guest for today, they graduated with an undergraduate degree from the University of San Francisco in Media, Business, and Film Studies. And then they went on for a Masters of Arts in Film and Television Production from the Met Film School at London's prestigious Ealing Studios. But जहाँ इनके काम की बात आती है, that's where the craziness and fun really starts. Their debut film, May I Have This Seat? क्या मैं ये सीट ले सकती हूँ? Has received critical acclaim across Europe, Asia, and North America, and it was also submitted as a student BAFTA and Oscar in 2020. The story is very complex with such nuance in characters that it's very rare to see media coming like that out of Pakistan. They've also worked as an associate producer on the hugely successful feature film Joyland, which was directed by Saim Sadiq. Their work apart from this has encompassed so many fields and ideologies कि अगर हम list करना भी चाहें, it wouldn't be enough. But they're also currently a teaching fellow at LUMS and they work in the Comparative Literary and Cultural Studies department. They're one of the most well-respected instructors over here, and rightfully so, because I've also had the pleasure of being in the presence of one of their guest speaker sessions, and it left a really big impact on me. तो अगर आपको अभी तक नहीं पता चला कि कौन है, I'll just tell you. It is Sir Tabish Habib, and welcome, sir. I hope you're doing well, and it is an honor to have you here with us. I've been really looking forward to this for a long time, and we're very excited to have you on board.
I'm very good. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
No, sir. I think it's only fair that we give ऐसी नादीद सा introduction.
नहीं बहुत अच्छी बात है मैं खुद भूल जाता हूँ so it's nice to hear that this is stuff that I have done but thank you so much for having me. I think we tried to do this last semester and I got a little unwell so I'm glad we're finally doing this and I think this is the first show of the semester we're doing. Yeah. So let's try and start it with a bang.
Yeah,
looking forward to it.
I'm really glad that we're finally doing this. So before we get into the details of your work and the ideology behind it, we'll like to start off with just a basic sense of understanding the scope of this conversation and to give us direction. So it's a heavy question and pretty loaded, but I think it's important nonetheless. And that is, how would you describe your art and your approach to it? And do you think that understanding it in a particular way impacts the outcome as well?
Ooh, okay. That's a very broad question. I mean, for me, the art that I sort of associate, it's very difficult. For the longest time, I had a lot of trouble sort of just associating myself with being an artist, right? But I kind of see myself as a filmmaker, and those two things are intertwined. But for me, as a filmmaker, when I see work that I kind of look at as art, it's associated with truth, right? So any kind of art or film that I see that resonates in some form of truth, that for me is art, specifically when I talk about my field. And that's what I look for. Those are the kinds of films that I like to watch, that I like to work on, right? That are very, very deeply embroiled in truth. So that's how I would answer that question.
So when we talk about the past and even when we talk about the present, the truth is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so how important is it to understand that discomfort is a general and necessary byproduct of the truth, and to show that in the films that you make?
No, I think it's extremely important, right? Anurag Kashyap has this talk that he does. It's like addressing a bunch of folks, and is talking about how somebody outside of the industry made his way into the industry, and he talks about how he likes to make films that make people feel uncomfortable, right? And the truth, especially in the kind of environment we live in, is oftentimes uncomfortable. But I think that's also what makes it worth pursuing, right? I mean, it is important for films to be entertaining, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge facet of it, right? That's why people go to watch them. But making you feel uncomfortable by talking about topics that sort of resonate with how you lived your life or your own existence, right? I think it leads to really, really important conversations. That's where the discomfort comes in, right? You feel discomfort watching something. Some people might be more intrigued and they might keep wanting to watch it. Some people might be put off and might want to watch something that's maybe a bit lighter. But if you kind of give it the chance, it will lead to a very, very insightful conversation that will give you a better understanding of what's going on around you, right? So that's why I think it's very, very important. I generally do, like, some of the filmmakers that I go to, whether they be Irani or European or Mexican, they are often filmmakers that do A, surprise me, and B, make me feel uncomfortable. So I think it's very, very important.
And I think that carrying that discomfort with us is also, it's a stepping stone to growing as a person, because it's not only character development on screen, it's does the viewer develop, as they're watching a movie. I had an instructor once tell me that अच्छा अदब वो होता है जिससे आप कुछ नया सीखें.
Oh, बिल्कुल.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you're in your comfort zone, this is a bit of psychology really, but like if you're constantly stuck in your comfort zone, you don't necessarily grow that much, right? You might feel comfortable and you might, let's say, feel like you're in a bit more control of your surroundings and everything that's going on, but you won't necessarily grow. At least that's what I've learned, right? And I actually know people who constantly put themselves in uncomfortable situations, almost like, an exercise.
Yeah.
And sometimes that yields good results, sometimes that doesn't yield good results, but I think the learning and the growth that comes with it is always there. So yeah, I think it's a really, really powerful way of going about your art or your life or your work.
And I think it's also very important to keep that in mind, that even at the back of your mind, subconsciously, कि, okay, मैंने सोचना है कि just because something is easy doesn't mean that it's right. Maybe it's difficult, and that's why it is right.
Yeah.
So I think that with difficulty and discomfort comes also the idea of how our creative endeavors work out, because even while creating, we can feel discomfort. But particularly when we have aspects of resistance in them, which is very prevalent in your work, it becomes even more complicated, and you have to be very nuanced in your approach. So how do you think that resistance fares in the work that you do, and what implications that can have on a society like ours especially?
Okay, so for me, I think the resistance factor or the resistance theme that comes out from my work is really a byproduct of my upbringing, right? So what I tell people is I grew up in a matriarchal household in a patriarchal society. Okay, my mother is the main breadwinner. My sisters are 10 odd years older than me, but like they've had a significant influence on me, right? It's almost like growing up with three mothers. And they're very free-spirited, independent, ambitious women who grew up in a culture, Pakistani culture, where, let's say that isn't like the most acceptable kind of mindset for women to have. And to watch them struggle and persevere through that had a profound impact on me, right? Even though I didn't necessarily know it at the time when I was younger. But as I got older, right, it shaped my perspective. And I think that's where a lot of the stories that I write, a lot of the lead characters that I construct, they are kind of inspired by those women in my life, right? And I think kind of putting them in these sort of patriarchal structures where they have to just struggle to be themselves. That's what I find most interesting, right? They're not like people would look at them and look at their behavior. Like even if you take Sonia and May I Have the Seat, right? People would look at them and think, oh, she's being rebellious and she's being this, but she's just being herself, right? And it's very unfortunate that she lives in an environment, in a society where just being yourself is considered to be wrong, right? ना कोई चोरी कर रही है, ना कुछ गलत कर रही है किसी के साथ, she's just being herself. So I don't even know if like if you look at it that way, is it really like a form of resistance or is it just being yourself? And because the critique comes from the structure with which you are living in, right? And I think the same thing applies to Joyland as well, right? All of these characters are forced to sort of hide who they are, live like these double lives, right? And I think that's an extension of what a lot of Pakistanis kind of have to go through. I was listening to this thing that Zoya Akhtar said, where they were asking her, why does Bollywood have so many love stories? And it's like, क्योंकि हमें प्यार करने का हक नहीं है. Right? Yeah. That's why we follow all these love stories in fantasy. And it's really true, but it's also really heartbreaking to think about. Right? That's why we're all going around and listening to all these love songs and watching all these love stories, right? So yeah, I think that's what kind of ties into resistance.
I think that's particularly interesting because you mentioned something just right now that they're not resisting, they're just being themselves.
Yeah.
But in a society like ours, being yourself is a form of resistance as well.
Yeah.
Especially if you're someone who does not cater to the system, when you're non-conformative. And so your characters are very complex. And to get more into that, we'd have to talk about May I Have This Seat.
Okay.
And particularly before we get into details, the characters. I've seen the film multiple times.
Okay.
And every single time I come out asking myself something new कि अच्छा सोनिया ने अब ये किया नहीं वो तो अपनी बेटी को सिर्फ प्रोटेक्ट कर रहा था right and उनका तो हक बनता है अपनी बेटी के साथ बैठना and then on the other side you're thinking no it's a pregnant woman and so you have to be accommodating because that's the culture that we're surrounded by and then when it comes to a climax the entire problem but at the end the way he shields her with the dupatta it's again it goes back to discomfort and it made me very uncomfortable. I've written a paper on it for one of my classes. And
Did you get an A?
Yeah, I think so. The complexity of the characters for me particularly lies in the fact that they're not black and white.
Okay.
They're very grey.
Yeah, and very nuanced.
So, can you walk us through the process of how you come up with these characters and whether it's a deliberate effort to make them like this, or do you think that given with the factors that you've accounted for, your upbringing and your background, does that happen naturally?
I mean, it's very, very important to construct all these characters with a lot of nuance, right? That's the main thing I look at. And I think a lot of that has been inspired by the Irani films that I have seen, right? When I think about character and when I think about constructing character. But the nuance element is very important because then you can understand both sides of a perspective, right? Masood का जो character है, जो मतलब कि अपने बच्चे को पढ़ा रहा है और उसके साथ बैठा हुआ है, he's coming from a more conservative mindset, but it's not necessarily an unethical mindset, right? That's kind of how I look at it. Within his set of values, he is being a good person, right? So that's where the conundrum comes in, right? When he's, she's falling, but he's grabbing her, and the audience we're unsure as to whether he's grabbing her because he's, got ill intentions or because he's trying to protect her fall, right? And that's what creates the confusion, not just among the audience, but the people on the bus as well in the film. But I think that the turn that comes at the end, when he, for me at least when I was writing it, when he picks up the dupatta and shields her, uske values ke mutabik, right? That's when he realizes, because prior to that, uski izzat ka sawal hota hai. ठीक है? Because, uski video ban gayi hai, it's going to go on social media and all of that stuff, right? Can't mess with his izzat. Very, very important. But by the time you get to that, right, he realizes कि line भी है ना, फिल्म में बात का बतंगड़ बना दिया आपने. तो वो इतना वो हो गया है कि अब when her water breaks, he realizes like, oh wow, okay, this has just gone way too far. and it is my fault partly as well, right? I've also been part of this. Prior to that, he's angry at her because she's made the video, but when he sees that, he's like, he realizes that it's also his fault, right? And I mean, for her, there's a lot of people that watch this film and have this kind of expectation that she is also a little at fault, which may be true to some extent, but like, I look at it as, क्या करे वो आई है वो बस में ज्यादातर मर्द उसको घूर रहे हैं, ठीक है, बैठने की जगह उसको नहीं मिल रही, तो you know, and until she sees her friend, a familiar face who's not exactly the nicest person in the world to her either as the film progresses, but it's a familiar face, right? So that kind of gets her to calm down. So that's kind of how I looked at it, and I think what I wanted to come out of the film, which I had no idea whether it would actually happen when I made it, was I wanted to start a conversation, right? And I've been quite fortunate that whoever does watch it, it does lead to a really interesting conversation, and people point out things that I didn't even think about sometimes, right? So that's kind of what I was going for.
I think it's very good insight to know about that, because I'm just thinking about how I understood the film, and that really adds, because what you mentioned about Masood's character at the end, when the realization, I didn't realize that pehle, you know, like maybe if I hadn't said all of that, maybe if it hadn't gone to this extent, this wouldn't have happened. But another particular character, which you've discussed this earlier also, is the people, the bystanders. It's like the audience also. They're
an extension of us.
Yes. And the fact that they're almost looming over Sonia, especially when she falls down, and with just their piercing eyes, it's very reminiscent of especially the experiences of women in public spaces, and particularly public transport. I've been in public transport, and I think that it's part of the reason why that film particularly made me so uncomfortable was because I've experienced that. And so I know how bad it is. So, but that's a big risk to take as well. Because it's an apt adaptation of what the system looks like. So how did you come about doing that? Did you think that there would be particular backlash towards it? Especially because when we consider gender in our area of the world, oftentimes masculinity is very protected. And there is an active effort to protect it as well. But there's a form of transgression over here, especially by Masood. And then the audience particularly is just a transgressor. So how does that work?
So a really, really important facet of filmmaking is research, right? So, jo Speedo Bus hai, I took it for a good 3 to 4 weeks when I was doing research. And at the time when I wrote the film, I wrote it partly between London and Pakistan. And in London, I would take public transport everywhere because that's just how that city works. But when I came here and I started taking Mall Road Pe, I would just take the bus back and forth, and I would try and have interesting conversations with some of the Canade ke students, right? Or NCA ke students, right? There were certain characters that I came across that were kind of extensions of Sonia, right? Students that would just go and sit wherever they wanted. Acha, in the film, there is like a segregation of sorts. Auraton ka section Y, mardon ka section Y. It's kind of like an unspoken thing on the Speedo bus. And that's what, when I saw that kind of interaction, that's where that was the initial base of coming up with this kind of narrative. But what I did notice is when you're talking about the discomfort, right, that the female students, the young journalists, or just females in general feel in a public space, right? That was a very, very important thing, and that's not something I took lightly, right? I really wanted to understand it as well as I could, and I think for something like that, and it's very, very important to be a keen observer and a listener, right? You can't, for lack of a better way of explaining it, you can't mansplain that narrative, right? You have to understand it very, very well. And you have to do it with a lot of nuance. And that was my biggest fear, right? That I would get that wrong. Because it's not my experience, right? It's a female experience. So you have to understand that very well. You have to do your research. And you have to get it right. And that was very, very important for me. And it was also very important to have a lot of, females on the crew, right? You can't make a film like that just by being that one male director who's just telling people what to do, right? And I think there are some male directors that maybe make that mistake sometimes. If you're interested in a certain kind of character and a certain story, by all means go and do it, but do your research. Understand what you are talking about, right? You don't want to kind of start talking about a topic without fully understanding it, or at least feel comfortable or confident enough in your ability to talk about it. So that was very important for me.
I think this concept of understanding that the crew particularly come into equal importance when making a film, particularly when there's such a danger of the male gaze coming into play. That's fascinating, and I think that that's really what adds to the film, because when I see the film, for me to differentiate whether it's a male gaze or not is very complex. I know it's there, but I can't tell when it's starting and when it's stopping.
Mm-hmm. So there's two things that I should add to that. So number one, have you seen a film called Get Out?
No, I have not.
Okay, so it's a film by Jordan Peele, and it's about this young black man who's dating this white girl, and he's going to visit his white girlfriend's parents for like a holiday, right? And the film kind of takes a borderline horror, thrilling kind of turn, but it is really about the discomfort that a black man or a black person feels in white America, right? And it's very masterfully done how he showcases that. So, in a sense, even though these are two very, very different things, ठीक है, Desi Aurat in a public space, male gaze, Pakistan, black man in white suburban America, right? But there's a discomfort there, right? So I was kind of trying to create that in a very, very different kind of way. It's very, very different visual language and whatnot. So that was very important. Secondly, there were a lot of comparisons I made to how I could create, the discomfort that Sonia feels in a public space. So think of like Pakistani Twitter. Okay? As a, if a woman comes in who's like open-minded or like free-spirited or just has opinions and starts stating them on Twitter, and they're like, remotely controversial or, would touch on the kind of resistance that we were talking about earlier. हजारों comments और tweets आ जाएंगे, ये देखो क्या कह रही है, ये देखो उसने क्या पहना हुआ है, ये देखो किस तरह से सोच रही है, all of that stuff, right? So that's kind of how I likened everyone in the bus, right? So it's like, she's here, she's just there. It's almost like anything she does is like a tweet, and then everybody feels like they have the right to comment on it or judge it or make a video of it. और एक तमाशा सा बन जाता है, So yeah, these were different. There were different ways in which I was thinking about what it would be like, and I think all of that played into how it came out.
I think this really sheds light on how great the film is. But we also have to take into account that it has won a lot of accolades outside of Pakistan as well. So how do you think that the reception has been of the film in the West? And particularly, what makes this appealing to a Western audience? Because it's set in a very Desi context. A lot of cultural nuances as well. Even the language. It does have subtitles, but even the language is Urdu. Yeah. And it's very Desi Urdu. And so
Punjabi. Punjabi.
So what aspect of this film do you think was the appealing factor to particularly a Western audience?
Okay, this is going to be a long answer. There's a lot of ways I can respond to this. First of all, it was very, very important for me in terms of how I want to showcase my work, my films, my writing, that it should feel localized, right? The last thing I want to do, a criticism that I hear of other people's work that really grinds my gears, I guess I would be part of that criticism for some people's work. Sorry about that. But, कि ये गोरों के लिए बनाया है, ठीक है? That just like completely grinds my gears, क्योंकि मैं नहीं उस तरह सोचता, I like, the accolades and the reception that the film has gotten abroad, but I'm not catering to that audience specifically. My mind is, I want to cater to an audience here and there. It's a very difficult task, right? I mean, Joyland is a classic example, right? Kudos to Simon, the whole crew that worked on it, but like you want to appeal to both audiences, right? So that was very, very important for me. And that's why, I mean, this was also my thesis film at Met, right? Theoretically speaking, वो तो उर्दू नहीं बोलते ना पंजाबी बोलते हैं, so they're just looking at the performances and the subtitles and whatnot, engaging, what's going on from that. But it was very important for me, right? I think as an artist, awards and accolades are nice, but what is your, what are your goals for yourself? What are you trying to say, right? That's in some ways, I think it's bigger than how things are received, right? It's very, very important for you to set that goal for yourself. So that's one thing. Secondly, there's a lot of feedback that I've gotten from not just, colleagues of mine, filmmakers from different parts of the world, right? Two things that always stood out to me. And, if you watch the film on YouTube, there's the YouTube comments there, they're from all parts of the world, right? I think I talked about that in like that guest lecture, but like New Zealand se koi kuch keh raha hai. Everyone's getting very, very heated on this debate about like whether somebody should offer a seat to a pregnant lady, which is the central question, I think, that moves the narrative forward. But one thing that I heard that I really, really liked was all the extras on the bus, right? One of my professors I've met said he said he's never seen people like that before.
Oh.
All right. And it comes down to, I mean, this was 3 years ago, this is 2020, but people aren't very, they don't really know what Pakistanis look like. They don't. They've only been fed images on, CNN, BBC, which are obviously warped a certain way, but like, they're not sure agar hum, Saudi ke Musliman hain, ke Indians hain, ke Irani hain, and we're very distinct, right? Especially Punjab ya Lahore ke log, right? जो आपके सवारी होते हैं. So that was one thing that really moved me, right? Because it wasn't something I was specifically trying to do. I wasn't like, I want unique faces. I just wanted realistic faces who could deliver the lines that I wanted them to deliver. So that was one thing that really struck me. And another thing a colleague of mine said is like, I don't know if this is true. It just kind of resonated with me. He's like, I think the Western audience really likes your film because it reminds them of what the West used to be like 100 years ago. I was like, I don't know if that's a compliment, but but yeah, I think there's a lot of that, right? And I think that's also why Irani cinema has kind of exploded over the last 10-15 years, or further back 20 years with Asghar Farhadi's work in the West, right? They love those narratives. They love the questions and the philosophical discussions that come from all of those stories. So I think that's why it's resonated so much.
And I think what you mentioned about the professor not knowing what a Pakistani looks like, Mr. Paki has a video up on his Instagram.
I've seen that, yeah.
And it talks about what does a Pakistani look like. Because while we do look a certain way, there's no distinct Pakistani face. Because you have famous people, celebrities that particularly with their skin color, and then you have very normal people also. I think a very interesting example of this is Parizad, and their depiction with all the questions that come with representation in that one.
I've talked about this in one of my classes.
Yes, with all the questions of representation that drama has, but it does also bring apart another question, which is what does a Pakistani person look like, and within Pakistan, how are they treated because of what they look like? West to apni jagah hai hi. So, and that brings us to the next question of Joyland.
Okay.
And so, Joyland is one such piece of work that has had a lot of critical acclaim and criticism as well, particularly because of the audience.
Yeah.
Because of who's watching it. Not because I don't think that the problem particularly stems with the content, because content is being made in the West on similar, not exactly the same, but similar lines.
I know what you mean.
But the audience for this movie is Pakistani. And so that's when representation becomes a problem. So in a movie like Joyland, when there's, especially in Pakistan, when there's so much censorship, and there's a lot of self-censorship as well, a lot of creators and filmmakers choose to not talk about certain topics because we know how it's going to be perceived. So how has the idea of censorship played into the work that you've done?
It has zero stake.
Zero stake?
Yeah, I don't think about censorship at all. Listen, again, going back to what I was talking about earlier about truth. If you are trying to say something, you should not think about censorship at all. Should you have an audience in mind? Sure. Should you talk about things that you understand? Absolutely. But I think if you start censoring what you are trying to say before you even start trying to say it, you're not being sincere in whatever it is that you're trying to say. So I don't think about censorship. I know that's a difficult thing to advice to give young filmmakers, because imagine you put like a year of your life into something and you put it out there and it gets banned and it hurts like hell. I've seen what our Joyland crew has had to go through. I've seen what Sarmat Kuset has had to go through, and it's really, really tough. It's really, really tough. But it is also, I feel, the price you pay for the pursuit of truth that you've taken on, and I think it's important. Again, it's tough. I think a creative field in any part of the world you go to is really, really tough. I don't think it's easy. People have this idea ke बाहर जाके west में बहुत आसान होता है, and maybe to a certain extent because you have a stronger sense of community and maybe you have more creative facilities there. In that sense it is, but it's tough everywhere. It really, really is. And it's important that you pursue it with a certain level of ethics and nuance. And yeah, I don't really think about censorship at all, right? I mean, I'm sure if you make a very controversial film or something that's deemed controversial, it might impact you a certain way, and after that you're like, you know what, I'll just make something light. I know I can think of filmmakers that have gone that route. I totally understand that, but I still think that if you feel that there is a story that you want to tell and it's important to tell that story, you should absolutely go on and tell that story. I just saw the trailer for Vakri recently. I don't know if you've seen it, but yeah, that doesn't look like the kind of film that would be well received by the powers that be, but I was so happy to see that trailer. I'm so happy that it's out there. अब इस तरह की फिल्में बन रही हैं, बेशक बाहर के producers हों, but ये जो कहानी है ना हमारी, these are very important. Also, going back to your other question, Pakistan is such a hotbed for stories. Like this thing that I've been saying for a while now. It's like Pakistan is a lot of things, but it's not boring. Okay, and for filmmakers and storytellers, there's so much to explore. And there is no better people equipped to explore those stories than us. Yeah. बाहर से कोई लोग आके बताएंगे, they won't fully understand it because there's so much going on here, right? And it's unfortunate, that the stories that we want to tell are kind of, they're not given the open space to be explored like they should be. To a certain extent, you do have that with your drama circuit, right? थोड़ा सा वो बदल रहा है, and hopefully और बदलता रहेगा. But I just think that it would be nice to see an industry where people are allowed to explore all those stories more and more. And also, it's so great for your economy.
Yeah.
Right? You create so many jobs. On an average film, you have like a crew of 100, sometimes 200, right? That's so many. A lot of these people are day workers. Daily wages पे चलते हैं. तो उनका तो काम बढ़ेगा. What's wrong with that? We don't want our industry to thrive like it used to back in the 60s and 70s. I think it's a win-win all around, right? And like banning something. That's the other thing with banning something, right? Sorry, I'm going to get into this now. How can you judge whether adults are allowed to see something or not? Right? If they don't want to see it, they don't have to go see it. ठीक है? आप पैसे देके कुछ देख रहे हैं. ठीक है? It's not कि आप फ्री में जाके देख रहे हैं. ठीक है, अगर आपने नहीं देखनी आप ना पैसे दें. ठीक है, जस्ट बिकॉज वो चल रहा है उसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि कोई प्रोपेगेंडा मॉडल कहीं से चल के किसी को ब्रेन वॉश कर रहा है. That's not how it works. At least that's not how I see it. If you see somebody, committing murder in a film, that doesn't necessarily mean you will decide to go commit murder. Are we all sheep here? And why do you think of your people as that? How are they going to grow going back to that, right? If you just think of them as that. तो हाँ, ये एक है fallacy जिसका पता नहीं क्या होगा, but क्या
I think with this, the concept of agency within the audience needs to be very well understood. That as an audience member, I understand that I am responsible for what I do.
Yeah.
And for what even I understand, I once had another teacher tell me कि आपको हर किताब से मुतासिर नहीं होना चाहिए, हर कहानी से मुतासिर नहीं होना चाहिए. Some things are meant for you to be seen, heard, but not consumed. And you can't let them consume you as well.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very important. Again, that goes back to the responsibility of the viewer and the consumer as well.
Yeah.
But one thing that you mentioned is कि यहाँ पे कहानियाँ हम सब लोगों की हैं.
बिल्कुल.
But one aspect that we see in the films that you worked on is, and it's not exactly resistance, it is what we started this show with, and we started with Zindagi Se Darte Ho. And usme there's a misra that says ek fard ki nawa aayi. And what we defined a fard was as someone who is non-conforming.
Okay.
So someone who is ready to stand up to society. वो समाज के खिलाफ खड़े हो सकते हैं. And that's the characters that we see in the films. But it's important to understand that that's the characters that we probably are outside in our normal lives as well.
Yeah.
So...
Or some facet of who we are.
Yeah, exactly. So considering all of this, it's definitely been very different to how blockbuster Pakistani films have operated, because they have borrowed inspiration from the East, not from the West.
Yeah.
And so how do you think that now, given with the idea of representation particularly, and this change has been pretty radical, especially in the past 10 years. And so, and I think one of the starts of this was Shoaib Mansoor's Bol. Starts from,
Cinema ka revival.
Yeah. So ever since then, there's been a very subtle change, but in the past 5 to 6 years, then there's been a very strong and rapid change as well. So how do you think that entails for what Pakistani film industry can look like in the future?
Okay, so first of all, I think you just need to have more films coming out every year. I think there's 15 to 20 films that come out. There need to be more. ठीक है, वो commercial फिल्में हो जिनमें item numbers हो और कोई खास कहानी ना हो, या फिर films like Joyland or Zindagi Tamasha or Comedy. I think the more films you have, the more your industry develops, and I have absolutely no issue with your commercial cinema. Like, I think it's important for your industry, and I think it's important to fill up cinema seats, right? But हर तरह की फिल्में होनी चाहिए. बैन किसी चीज़ को नहीं करना चाहिए, ठीक है? उससे कोई फ़ायदा नहीं होगा, ना इंडस्ट्री का फ़ायदा होगा, ना अवाम का फ़ायदा होगा, ना मुल्क का फ़ायदा होगा. Right? It's important for you. It correlates to any country's growth, whether that's economic or social, right? You can see that in Iran, you can see that in Korea, you can see that in so many places, right? It's very, very important. And I would say, okay, so you're talking about representation, right? Obviously, there's ethical things to consider, and it would be better if... I think that just comes with developing an industry, right?
Yeah.
So you're talking about Bowl, and again, jitni filmeं आएंगी, jitne filmmakers आएंगे, जिनकी original stories होंगी, original voices होंगे, उससे ही ये चीज़ें बेहतर होंगी. And representation matters whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Okay? You can't run away from it. It will come back to bite you in the face in some way or shape or form. So I think that's very, very important. One very, very important, aspect of Joyland, and I would say, like, in many ways is like the heartbeat of what makes Joyland such a amazing story, is Alina Khan, right? Not just her performance, but her, in a way, she's kind of providing... the character in the film is very different from who she is in reality, but it is in many ways an extension of, what she represents, right? The community that she represents, the Khwaja Sira community. And I think that was very, very important. There was another drama that was going around that had a male actor playing a Khwaja Sira, right, in a lead role. I'm not going to say which one. But it's important to have Khwaja Sira kahaniyan, but it's also important to take representation and casting very, very seriously, because I think that's how your industry grows and develops. Yeah.
And I think with casting and crew, there's a new question of streaming platforms that comes about now, because films can create jobs and they should create jobs. I think a lot of people, if even they can work on like a project base, maybe they work on one film and then the next one, I think that can definitely benefit them in a lot of ways. But how do you think that fares that now we have streaming platforms and a lot of cinema-going culture is being reduced? So it's now more of a social thing. So if you want to make a plan with your friends, you're going to go watch a movie at the cinema. But especially in Pakistan, people don't really go to the cinema alone. They'll just go on Netflix or on another, maybe Hulu or Amazon or HBO. So, and again, which are Western platforms.
Yeah.
और पाकिस्तान की तो बहुत कम फिल्में हैं नेटफ्लिक्स पे वैसे ही. So how do you think that fares, that streaming platforms coming into play, that fares for the Pakistani film industry?
Well, there's been a bunch of local streaming platforms that have tried, right? There was Picture TV, there's StapMad, and they're trying to kind of grow their own user base. I think aista ho jayega. Z5 Indian streaming platform also invested in a bunch of Pakistani productions. I think Chudails was one of them, right? So aista ye cheez hai. I think it's just about finding that the right formula for that to work. I'm talking about locally, right? So whether that means, registering your streaming platforms in Dubai so that you can, bypass the Censor Board and all of that, right? If you want to go that route, that's fine. Abhi recently Momna Durayat ka ek show aa raha hai Netflix pe that has Fawad Khan and a bunch of folks in it that's being shot right now. So aista ye cheezein badal rahi hain. And it can't be ignored for too long, right? Our population is just way too big and there's way too many users. I mean, I walked into Lums today, there's a Spotify event going on, right? Spotify is increasing its users here, right? So, I mean, just like it's India's strength, it's our strength in a way as well. So, I am a little optimistic on this. I think aista ye cheezein badal jayengi. I think ye jo, again, everything's going to come back to the banning culture, right? These are the kind of situations that scare platforms like Netflix away. ठीक है, हम यहाँ क्यों आए और क्यों पैसे डालें इन कहानियों में अगर इनके powers that be जाके हमें कहेंगे कि we can't do it, right? So it's like an own goal. I call it own goal behavior. आप constantly own goal मारते जा रहे हैं, क्यों, फायदा क्या है? So yeah, I imagine it would change. You just can't ignore it, right? And with the success of films like Joel and In Flames, that's another one. Zarar Khan's film, right, that debuted at Cannes, right? So there's every year you're hearing about a film that's doing really well abroad, and that's creating a conversation. It's creating some excitement, and it's also going to create that. So that's also something that happened with Slumdog Millionaire, right? The success of Slumdog Millionaire in India, even though there was a Western director there, it created that bridge between Bollywood and Hollywood, right? Which eventually led to RRR getting an Oscar and performing at that big stage, right? So I think it's only a matter of time, but it's all moving in the right direction.
I think it's a good thing that we're finally going there. Yeah. So I can watch all the films without wanting to pirate them.
Yeah, that would be great.
Because that's not very ethical. So you've also mentioned that, particularly Irani cinema is also, a Muslim country, and their censor board works a little differently. So in comparison to that, Pakistan's censorship board future, does that look a little brighter? Especially how would you think that it would fare if we have actual film critics on the censor board, people who have the relevant knowledge for film and art and media on the censor board?
I can think of some of the best film minds that I've come across in Pakistan who've been offered positions on the censor board. It really doesn't matter who's on the censor board. Okay. The censor board itself is the problem. You have 3 censor boards in Pakistan, right? One based in Sindh, one based in Punjab, and one based federally. अगर आपकी फिल्म तीनों censor board pass कर ले, which Zindagi Tamasha I think passed, right? I think Joyland also passed it, or both of these films passed it. All it takes is one person coming in and complaining against it, going to court complaining against it, and all of a sudden, the film is banned again. So it's just a flawed concept, right? And it needs to be removed immediately. In Iran, I think what the system, the way it works is they have a religious scholar, and he is, he is the ultimate decision maker. I'm pretty sure it's a he. I really doubt it would be a she. But yeah, he gets to decide, whether a film should be banned or not, right? At least it's like a system that works, right? अगर वो कहे कि नहीं ये फिल्म नहीं लग सकती तो नहीं लग सकती, ठीक है? अगर उसने कह दिया कि लगेगी तो लगेगी, right? No one's going to come in there and say कि, we want to ban this, we want to complain against it, it's still there. And then, it's just basic, adult behavior. Again, you pay for a ticket, you go watch it. You don't want to pay for a ticket, you don't go watch it. Very, very simple.
And again, that religious scholar is probably trained
Absolutely,
and qualified.
Yeah, well versed in, deciding कि क्या offensive है, क्या नहीं है.
Because I think it's important that when we talk about the censor board, we're not saying that we want the religious bodies to be removed at all. Yeah. No, they should definitely be there. But in a way it's conducive to all environments.
Yeah.
So, and we can learn a lot from those bodies as well. They can offer insights, particularly if the censor board can offer us insights into how representation can be better made.
Yeah.
And they can help us guide all of that. But I think maybe for the censor board to be a guiding tool would be the best way forward for Pakistan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A conversation between the artists and the censor board or the people in charge of censorship.
So with this, regrettably, we move to the end of the interview.
Okay.
And I ask my final question.
Okay.
Which is that now that you're in a position of teaching, there's definitely a lot of values of creating art that you would want to inculcate in your students. And हमारे नाज़रीन तो सारे इस class में नहीं आ सकते. But what are some things that you want your students to learn, and also people who are watching this right now?
So, I mean, my course isn't necessarily, I mean, I'm not expecting everybody from my course to come out and be filmmakers, right? Some of them are artists in different fields. I mean, they're young students, right? They're figuring stuff out. They're trying to learn about, different topics, different ideas. I mean, we watch a range of different kinds of films from different parts of the world, analyze them, understand them, look into the practical essence of how they are made, right? And there's a bunch of different things that I think students learn from my course. First of all, filmmaking itself, it's a team-oriented sport almost. I like to think of it as, right? Because you can't make a film alone. एक बंदा अकेले film नहीं बना सकता, right? You need a crew, you need people. So collaboration, right? Whether students from my class end up being filmmakers or not, I think by the end of the course, they work on 2 films, right? 2 short films, which means that they get to take, an HOD role, either as a writer, a director, a cinematographer, an editor, or a producer. And just working as one of those roles with each other, I think it teaches you so much. It prepares you for so many. I mean, filmmaking has changed me as a person in so many ways, right? I was a very unorganized person when I was a student, right? I have become very detail-oriented and very organized, because it just leads to efficiency, right? Filmmaking is one of the few art forms that work on, a deadline. If you're shooting in the day, you want to get all of your shots while there is still daylight, right? So that's why you make a schedule, you make a very detailed schedule, you rehearse, you do test shoots, all of that stuff. So I think being very, very organized is one thing that comes out of that, which I think is very, very important. As far as the kind of films that I want them to make, it is, films that are saying something important, and the kind of films that give an audience an idea of who the person is that has written this or is directing this. How do they see the world? What do they think is going on, right? It's all great to make stuff that you find entertaining, and that is part of it is important, but there should be something deep within there, that you are trying to say. And that's what I look for, right? I always try and kind of frame my students' work or guide them in a way where I'm like, "Acha, kya kehna cha rahe ho?" So, yeah, that's what's important to me.
I think that's great. And with that, we conclude our interview. And I think it's very important to understand that what we say, how we say it, and then the medium that we use is it can make or break the deal. And I think that moving forward, we should all be mindful of what we say and how we say it. But
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming today and taking the time out and the entire rescheduling process. So we're very grateful that you're here. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, this was great. I was actually really enjoying that conversation. No, I'm glad we finally got to do this. Apologies again that it took so long to finally do it. But yeah, I hope we have started this new semester on a good note.
Yeah. Thank you so much once again, sir. So that's today, and it was one of the best conversations I've had generally outside of, the show as well. And while we couldn't cover everything that we might have wanted to do because of limited time, I hope that this leaves all of you with important lessons and insights on how you can potentially shape your own filmmaking career or even just a storytelling career. And with that, we close today's episode. बहुत देखने का बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. मिलते हैं आपसे एक वक्फे के बाद. अल्लाह हाफिज.
Allah Hafiz.